I'm going to be a senior in high school. I'm 17, and I just studied abroad in Rennes, France, and now I'm back in the US. I live in California currently, and I go to a boarding school in Indiana.
Okay. Well, I read the article that you wrote whilst you were in France about the Ukrainian refugee.
Thank you.
I thought it was a very interesting story. I like the way that you took one Ukrainian refugee and one host, so that you didn't overcomplicate it, but you managed to cover all the issues. And I also like the fact that you had a good grasp of journalistic form, that it was written in a circular structure. You began with Natalia and you came back to Natalia. I was pleased to see that you had that sense of form.
I decided to write about the Ukrainian refugees because with SYA, my school, we did a cross webinar with the campus in Spain and the campus in Italy, and our theme was the Ukrainian war, and France got the Ukrainian refugees. And so with the refugees, I really thought it was really personal, because in the US, we're kind of assimilated from Europe in a way that it doesn't feel like we're too close to Europe, and it doesn't feel like of course, there are many refugees and immigrants who come to the US, but they're not as close as France is to Ukraine or the neighboring parts of like the European Union. And I also studied the European Union in my politics class, which this politics class I took in France actually inspired a lot of my interest for journalism and my interest for learning more about politics and things, because we studied the European Union, and I just got to learn how close these countries are to each other and the whole union in general with support and aid to refugees. So that's why I wanted to interview some refugees and make the article.
Apart from Natalia, did you meet any others?
I did not, but I had a friend who actually did another interview, and she was also on our webinar, and she interviewed a university student who was a Ukrainian refugee in France. So what is your experience, Helen, with Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees and just refugees in general? I know you have a big passion and interest about refugees.
Yes, well, I've been in Budapest since 2015 when the first refugee crisis happened. That was when refugees were coming from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, coming over the water between Turkey and Greece and up through the Balkans into Austria and Germany. So I saw that wave of refugees, and then I've witnessed the arrival of the Ukrainian refugees, and they're two rather different crises, in fact, both the kinds of refugees who arrived and the kind of response they received in Europe. The ones who were coming in 2015 from the Middle East, they were largely men, single men. They'd tended to leave their women behind because they didn't want to risk their lives on the water crossing, and they were coming to Europe in the hope of getting a foothold and then being able to bring their families to join them, whereas the Ukrainian refugees who arrived had been mostly women and children because their men have to stay behind in Ukraine to fight, and they've generally received a much warmer welcome in Europe as well. So I've been quite interested to contrast those two crises.
That's very interesting. And do you find that there's also a difference in terms of just the era that we're in right now, 2023 versus 2022, 2023 versus 2015?
On the one hand, we probably know more about refugee. On the other hand, there may be a bit of a fatigue as well because so many have come. So it's quite a challenge to keep the story in the public eye. When they were first coming in 2015, I wrote something like 40 stories for the UN. There was a big appetite for information. Now I kind of get the feeling that Europe sort of wants to bury the problem and not talk too much about it, in fact. Yeah, so we know more about refugees on the one hand, and we want to know less about them on the other.
That's very interesting.
Which is disturbing. Or was this just a sort of one-off topic while you were in France?
I'm not sure. I would love to do more on refugees. I feel like me being back in the US, it's kind of changed that like ability, as not ability, but I feel like it's definitely more complicated for me to find refugees and find people to interview that are refugees in the US versus how it was in France, because I feel like in some aspects France and Europe in general was a little more understanding of the refugees, and here in the US refugees can kind of get mixed up with immigrants and, you know, in this kind of melting pot of like people versus being separated by you're a refugee and you actually need this help and support versus you just came to America, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fine distinction, isn't it? I mean, they're all really people in need, of course, but to actually be accepted as a refugee, they have to prove that they would be in real danger if they went back home. So it's a bit of a moot point, isn't it? Who is a refugee? Who's just a migrant? You know, I've dealt with cases, for example, where Syrians were accepted as refugees, Malians were not, although they also were facing the danger of Islamic fundamentalism. So yeah, I mean, this is quite a question.
Yes, and
I guess it depends whether you see yourself working with refugees in future or whether you see yourself more as a journalist and refugees is just one of many topics that you might cover.
Yes. So you are a journalist, and what is your kind of main theme? Is it the refugees, or do you have an interest in all politics, all things? What's your niche?
Well, I guess you could say that I'm an expert on human interest stories. I worked for 30 years in Russia and was a specialist on Russia and communist countries. But one of the main things I did when I was in Russia was to write a column about my neighbours, my Russian neighbours, how they were living, how they were coping with economic reform. So I became a specialist on writing portraits, on writing what we call human interest stories. And then when I got effectively expelled from Russia in 2015 and I landed in Budapest and found there was a refugee crisis on my doorstep, I was able to apply the same skills of interviewing people. Before it had been Russians, now it was refugees. So I see myself very much as a journalist, not a specialist on refugees. Refugees has turned out to be one of the topics I've covered quite extensively, but I see myself as a journalist and I can write about absolutely anything.
I love that. I love that you found interest in Russia for 30 years, then the refugees, but you still find yourself as a culminating journalist in anything, and especially the human relations.
People often ask me what skills I have as a journalist. They say, oh, you're a journalist, you must be good at writing. And yes, I am quite good at writing, but that's not the main thing. The main thing is to have the right temperament, to be reasonably detached, to be fair, to be open and empathetic to people. Working as a journalist, sometimes I feel that I'm working a bit like a psychologist, especially if the person I'm interviewing, for example, has been through trauma. I'm giving them a quality of attention when I'm interviewing them that they might receive equally from a counsellor or a psychologist. Sometimes as a journalist, I feel I'm a bit like a diplomat. I'm building bridges between cultures. When I was working in Russia, I was helping Western readers to understand Russia. I was helping Russians to understand the West. Sadly, because of the war in Ukraine, that bridge now is broken, and I don't really have that diplomatic role anymore. And another thing, I think that sometimes working as a journalist, I'm rather similar to an anthropologist, going and living among people, speaking the language, living their lives with them, almost as if when I was in Russia, I was living almost as if I was a Russian, trying as best I could to understand what it's like to be a Russian, to understand their culture. And so being a psychologist, being a diplomat, being an anthropologist, there are many elements to it, and good writing is only part of it.
Wow, I've never thought of it like that. In journalism, you can also be a ton of different people and a ton of different professions in one. Because it's true that when you're interviewing people, you also kind of have to not counsel them, but make sure you're on the same page, right?
Well, you have to be interested in them. You have to listen to them, be interested in them. You have to tell their story. And in doing so, you help them to feel that they've been heard. When I started out in journalism and I would get sent, for example, to, the home of a family where the boy had just been killed in a car crash. And I thought, my God, how can I do that? How can I just break into this family home and thrust myself on these grieving people? To my surprise, they were actually pleased to see me. They were even expecting me. And my editor said to me, well, look, they expect the undertaker, they expect the priest, and they expect the journalist. And they wanted to tell me the story of their dead son. They showed me his photographs. They wanted to tell me his story. And it was quite a revelation to me that even people in the deepest trauma actually want to talk to me. And so I sort of started listening to people in all sorts of situations to hear what they'd been through, to bear witness for them. Same thing when I was in a field on the border between Serbia and Hungary, interviewing Afghan refugees who were trying to get into Hungary. One of the young men was just sobbing in my arm. Another boy sat up all evening just talking about how he'd been pursued by the Taliban. These people didn't mind telling me about their trauma. On the contrary, they wanted me to know, and through me, they wanted the world to know. So that came as quite a surprise to me, but I've very, very rarely found somebody who didn't want to tell me their story. For me, almost always the most challenging thing is getting access to the people I want to talk to. That can be difficult. Bureaucracies will put you through to the PR department and they won't let you have immediate access. But once you do actually get access to people, I've almost never found that the person didn't want to talk to me. And there's a great joy in that, in listening to the other person's story.
Yes, I totally agree with that.
What other stories have you written?
I've written 3 articles for Decoder. My first one was about baguettes. Actually, baguettes are the theme. Larger perspective is European energy crisis in France.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then my second article was the Ukrainian refugees. And then my third article was with the retirement pension and the strikes.
Yeah, there's been a lot of turbulence in France, hasn't there?
Yes. And I really loved writing all those 3 articles because they were when I was in France and specifically French-based. And I just know that if I was here right where I am in California trying to write those articles, it would not be the same.
Why not?
Because I just think that it's just difficult to really understand things from other countries when you're not in the actual country. There are tons and tons of articles on the New York Times and the Washington Post on the France retirement system, but none of them are like if you were going to read West France, which is the west side of France's regional newspaper, which I actually did a project on. So I just think that all the news in general, it's very regionalized, and if you're not in right there where it actually is, the news can kind of get congested and changed and not true. So I think it's really important to kind of be place-based. And now that I had that experience in France, not just with journalism, but just being actually there, I just feel like the things I've learned are so different from if I was outside of the perspective of the country, the same as if I was in California. So
yeah, but how about writing about things in California when you're in California? I mean, if you've been a foreign correspondent for long enough, you start to see your own country as a foreign country.
Oh, totally. Yes.
Yeah. So coming back from France, you must be seeing California now with rather different eyes.
Yes, I totally am. Like right when I stepped off of that plane into the U.S. customs line, I was just, whoa, like this is such a different country. And just the way home, and just also not just outside, but just my own home in general. Just being back in my own home, it's so It's just weird, even though this is where I grew up and stuff. So what surprised me firstly, just the US, is that the US is so diverse. I was not expecting it, because when I lived in the US, it's just normal that it's diverse, and it's not really a thing that I ever looked on twice, just that there are different cultures and different people of all sorts. And not that France isn't diverse, of course France has diversity as well, but just not as much, I would say, as the US. So it really surprised me, because something I would have never pointed out beforehand. And just first when I got there, instantly I could just tell and notice. And another thing is, I mean, just physical features of California versus France. Like the highs are humongous, and the food is just so different. But also, just I would say with my own self, I've changed a lot. I think before I didn't really have as much passion and consideration for my own culture. Before, I'm a Korean, and I'm a Korean American, and so before I didn't really have much interest, I would say, in learning about my Korean culture too much, because I just put it aside. But after being in France and experiencing French culture, I loved learning about a new culture and getting the experience to live there. So it's made me now want to learn more about my Korean culture. So I thank France for that a lot.
Oh, that's great. Well, look, I mean, I can see two possible story ideas there. Whilst you're still back in California with fresh eyes, whilst it's still quite new to you again to be home in California, write something about what surprises you about your own homeland. Well, okay. and secondly, this idea you have about your own Korean culture, that's interesting as well. I mean, I can see that you could do two stories there as a result of your trip to France.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
So I see that you are, by nature a journalist, and that refugees is one topic that you've covered, isn't it? But you're not necessarily thinking of a career in the humanitarian field. I can see that you think like a journalist, you see like a journalist.
Yes, I definitely think I want to pursue journalism. And overall, I really enjoy writing in general, so I would also love to write a fiction book as well. I'm writing a memoir right now, currently, of my year in France. So that's my newest project. And you mentioned that you're in Budapest right now.
Okay, well, in 2015, I had to leave Russia. This was when the war in Ukraine started 8 years ago. And at the time I was working for an Australian newspaper, and I thought I was going to Australia. So I came to Budapest with my cat to put him into EU quarantine so I could take him on to Australia. I left the cat with a vet in Budapest and went to Australia to talk to my bosses to see if they'd give me a job in Melbourne. And this was when the first refugee crisis happened, and when refugees were flowing through Colletti station in Budapest. So my Australian editor said, "Oh, Helen, you're actually much more used to us back in Europe." And they sent me back to Budapest. So I ended up staying in Budapest, went and picked my cat up from the vet, and Hungary became my Australia. I ended up staying here. Unfortunately, the cat died, but I reinvented myself here in Hungary. So you never know how life is going to turn out. As we say, man proposes and God disposes. That you may have one plan. I was planning to go to Australia. In actual fact, life turned out very differently for me, and Hungary became my Australia.
That's so interesting. And how did you get associated with News Decoder?
I'm an old Reuters correspondent, as are many of the correspondents who write for News Decoder. And I heard about the project. I liked the idea that, senior veteran correspondents like me and young journalists like you were both writing for News Decoder. I believe in the formula, the writer's formula: show, don't tell. So what I liked about News Decoder was that, by doing stories together and interviews like this together, we could show you what journalism is instead of giving you, 3 years of boring lectures in a media studies class. I actually taught journalism for a while when I was living in Australia, and I saw how awfully frustrated the students were on a media studies course in Adelaide. They kept saying, when are we actually going to go out and do it? And I really sympathised with them. If you really seriously want to be a journalist, don't do a media studies course, because you'll spend 3 years talking about the media, talking about journalism, instead of doing it. As well as writing, you've got to be able to have a subject that you will write about. And so you need to know things other than journalism. So study medicine, study economics, study history, study a language, study Russian, if you like, as I did. Study something, and then when you become a journalist, you will have knowledge and you'll know what to write about. If you only study media studies, that won't get you very far. Do you understand?
Yes. Thank you so much.
That's my personal view. Perhaps other people on News Decoder would disagree with me, but I think that the best training for a journalist is to study something else other than journalism. Then for example, if you've studied medicine, if you've studied biology, you can become a medical correspondent. If you've studied science, you can become a science and environmental correspondent. If you've studied history and geopolitics, you write about geopolitics. You will have some knowledge and a subject matter about which to write.
No, that totally makes sense.
So in my case, I didn't study journalism. I picked it up afterwards and on a 6 weeks course at Reuters. Journalism itself is a craft that you can pick up quite quickly and start doing it. Just do it as you already are. So when I was young, I had an unpaid internship on a provincial newspaper. I loved it. I had a natural aptitude for it. I loved it, and I was off.
Yes, I totally agree with what you're saying, because it's important to also not just know how to report and know how to interview people, but you need to have some background on what they're saying, right? And of course you can research that a couple days in advance, but it's important to not just have knowledge on only how to interview, how to broadcast, how to write, but just the overall picture is really important.
Yeah, these techniques you'll pick up, how to write, how to broadcast, how to edit, these techniques you'll pick up. But the question is, what are you going to write about?
Yes.
That's what are you talking about? That's the question. I don't know what you're planning to do university-wise.
I'm not sure. I might go for communications or perhaps journalism, but after what you said, I do agree that it's important to kind of have a broader perspective and study multiple things versus just the one-eye focus of journalism, because there's so much out there. And with journalism, you can pick it up everywhere. That is so true.
Yeah, if you want to do communications and journalism, do it with another subject. Combine it with it.
Yes.
Yeah, and there's a difference between communications and journalism. What is that difference?
Well, communications is more media and marketing, correct? While journalism is more writing and the process of storytelling.
Well, journalism is a public service. It's informing the public. It's an important pillar of our democracy, and it's a sacred role to inform the public with clear, truthful information. Communications, well, it has various purposes, doesn't it? It can be into advertising or propaganda, or it can be propaganda from good motives, like humanitarian propaganda, but it's not. It's pure journalism where you're reporting in order to give the public information.
Right.
And information is power. So when you give the general public information, you're allowing members of the public to to draw conclusions. And that's a very, very important.
Yes.
It's not advertising, it's not marketing, it's not propaganda, it's none of those things. It's informing.
Hey, thank you, Helen, for this conversation. It was really inspiring as well, because you are a journalist and I would call myself a writer who writes stories. But thank you so much for all of your insight and your stories, and I really enjoyed speaking with you today.
And if you want to talk to me in future, you've got my email address. If you want to write to me or ask me anything, I'm always happy to help.
Thank you so much.
And I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you too.